you for joining us, and thank you, Gwen, for giving the talk today. So I'm very honored to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Gwen Brekelmans. She's a lecturer in psychology at Queen Mary University of London. And before that, she also taught at University College London, and she also worked for different language learning and processing projects and labs. Her research interests lie in speech perception, production, second language learning, and sociolinguistics, and the combination of all. And apart from her research, as she just said, she's also dedicated to teaching research methods and academic writing. So today she's going to tell us about her recent work on language learning across the ages, which is very exciting. So over to you.
Brilliant. Let me just share the slides. There we go. Can I just double check that they are showing to everyone?
Yes. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So thank you so much for inviting me and for showing up to listen. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of some of the research I've been working on for the past 7 years by now. Okay. Looking at language learning in different age groups and particularly looking at the role of talker variability in this. So very broadly, as Cindy just said, I'm interested in how we learn second languages, foreign languages, broadly any languages that are not the native languages that you might grow up with, and particularly looking at how we might be able to improve the learning of these languages to see what we might, what kind of factors might play a role in this. And particularly as quite a few of you also do, the approach that I've taken in this so far is looking at language learning as a type of statistical learning, in the sense that people get information from the language input that they get throughout their life, and they find regularities and patterns in this input that they then use to try and learn to predict what's going to happen in language that they might come across in the future. So the sort of goal that people have when learning languages is applying this learned patterns from input that they've had so far to new stuff, so generalizing beyond what they've been trained on or learned. And particularly what that might look like in adults and children is something that across language learning research, as you might be aware, it has many different potential options of what that could do. There's, broadly speaking, two sides of things, in the sense that there's ideas that adults might do better than children on language learning, but there's also ideas that the earlier you start learning, the better you get in it. They all have some sensible grounds in various things. So looking at adults outperforming children might be due to children having more limited cognitive resources. So if the tasks are more difficult, then it might take them longer to actually learn things. And at the same time, adults have generally more experiences with learning language or languages, so they might be able to transfer some of the skills that they've used in learning languages to a new one that they're learning. But at the same time, children are said to learn languages more easily, usually down to they're more immersed in the input, they get more exposure, they have more time to dedicate to learning languages as their main task. And at the same time, they have less experience learning languages, which might sound contradictory, but that means they don't have to unlearn things that don't apply in the new language that they're learning. So that might make it easier. So there's lots of different directions that this can go in, and different sort of parts of learning languages tend to get slightly different results in who is finding things easier. But in the research I've been doing for the past while, is trying to combine these things together, looking particularly at talker variability. So the broad question I'm going to talk about today is whether there's a talker variability benefit in language learning, and whether the existence of this benefit differs for adults and children. And at this point, you might wonder, what is a talker variability benefit? Why should having talker variability be beneficial? What's the reasoning behind this? So I'll walk you through that first. Broadly speaking, the way talker variability, at least in my little corner of language learning research, second language speech learning, how it's been operationalized is you have a group of high variability, which consists of the language input that you're getting is spoken by more than one person. The number that is needed to get to high variability varies a little bit depending on the research. So that is something that's still not necessarily agreed on. But it's always compared to low variability, where you generally only have one person. So the talker variability difference is how many people are in the input that you're getting for spoken input. And particularly, the reasoning behind why it might be beneficial to have high variability input is something that you might have experienced if you've learned a language. So if you've learned from one particular person, so if you've learned a language in a classroom setting, for instance, you have one teacher, then you get really good at understanding that one teacher. So if you're learning from that teacher, by the time you have a test and that teacher is the one saying things out loud, you'll be really good at understanding that one teacher. But then you go out in the real world, you come across other speakers, and suddenly people are talking really fast, or they have a different accent, or they say things slightly differently, and it's a little bit harder to follow what they're saying. So generalizing to new things or new speakers that you haven't heard before is a little bit harder in that case. On the other hand, if you've got high variability input, so you've heard multiple people while you were learning, if you tested on one of the people that you've learned from, you'll still be really good at that, but you'll also likely be better at people you haven't heard before because you've got more of an idea of what possible variation is out there. So you know a little bit more about what's specific to the one person versus what is a possible range of options in that language. So being able to translate that to new people usually means that you get a little bit better at being able to understand new people as well. So having this variability helps you figure out which cues in the language are actually key in distinguishing contrasts that are relevant in what you're learning. And this has been shown to be helpful in adults in vocabulary learning, second language speech learning more broadly, accent learning, voice identification, cochlear implants, speech learning, many more things. So that's the reasoning for sort of focusing on that talker variability idea. It's got quite a lot of sense behind it, and there's quite a lot of research. But then you might wonder, why might there be a difference between adults and children? Adults, generally speaking, have a bigger network of people, so they might have more experience of who they might have come across. They also have more cognitive resources, broadly speaking, so that might impact how well they do on these types of tasks. On the other hand, children have a smaller social network that they might have been exposed through to this language and have more limited resources. So there's reason to believe that having talker variability sort of layered on top of this might end up leading to different results. Now, before getting back to that question I had at the start, also just a little bit of an idea of how to evaluate language learning and how to evaluate whether this talker variability makes any difference in how much language people learn. Broadly speaking, all of the paradigms I'll talk about are language learning paradigms, and this might be stating the obvious since you work with language learning yourselves, but just to make sure that we're all sort of aware of how this approach works for the particular studies I'm going to talk about. In all of these cases, there will be some sort of baseline or pretest to see at what level are people before we've taught them anything extra. Then we're going to train them on a particular thing. Can be a particular speech sound that they're learning, can be words that they're learning, any kind of thing. And then afterwards, sometimes more than one session of training, depending on how long the training lasts. And then afterwards, you want to see, okay, compared to before, how much have they improved? So there's a pre-post test design involved here to make sure that we can measure how much is really down to the training that we've given them specifically. So that's the key measure. How much change are we seeing? And sort of bringing all of these bits back, that's how we get to this question of, is there this talker variability benefit in language learning? And does the effect it has differ for adults and children? So do we see a benefit on how much people improve from pre-test to post-test in learning? And does that benefit differ for adults to children? So the first study I'm going to talk to you about is looking at learning a second language vocabulary, actually. So a slight dip into word learning. This was work with Rusa Sinkevičiūtė, Helen Brown, and Liz Wonnacott, where we looked at learning Lithuanian words and English children learning these words. So we went into primary schools to collect data from 7-year-olds and 11-year-olds, and then also tested some adults, and they were learning 12 Lithuanian words. This is a set of pictures representing the words that they were learning. And what we were trying to do is basically teach them the Lithuanian words for each of these items, and try and see, can they recall and produce the words after having been trained on this? And they were naive learners, so these were English speakers who hadn't had any Lithuanian before. So they were learning from scratch. Now, the training paradigm that we used here was a 2 alternative forced choice. So people were played the word, were given 2 options. So in this case, the bunny and the house. And then they were asked which of these 2 is the one that you're hearing. Training itself was only quite short, about 10 minutes, which if you're working with 7-year-olds might sometimes be necessary. And in that, they heard each word 8 times. So all of the 12 came by multiple times. And they had feedback on every trial to say, OK, you've chosen the correct one out of the 2 options that you just heard. Now, the way we manipulated talker variability in this experiment is that half of the words that they were trained on were presented by 8 different speakers. So each of the times they heard it, it was a different person saying that same word. So let's say the word for rabbit was said by 8 different speakers, the total 8 times that they heard it. The other half of the words, you heard the same person say it all 8 times. So there was a manipulation of talker variability in terms of which words they learned. And in terms of recall, so were these people able to remember what the words were? For the graph that we're looking at, we've got the 3 age groups. We've got the 7-year-olds, the 10-year-olds, and the adults. And the talker variability conditions are in the different colours. So light grey is the ones where they only heard 1 speaker. White is the ones where they heard multiple speakers. And what we found for adults is that they're near ceiling and they don't really make a difference between the 2 talker variability conditions because they can do this. They find it quite easy to remember these words after a relatively short amount of training. The 7-year-olds and the 10-year-olds, a little bit less so. They are above chance, but they don't show any difference between the talker variability conditions. So it doesn't really matter whether they heard the word from 8 different people or from the same person 8 times. But a difference starts showing up a little bit in production because that's harder also for adults. And adults in production are better at being able to reproduce the word in Lithuanian after they had the word presented to them from 8 different speakers than they are from 1 particular speaker. On the other hand, for the 10-year-olds and the 7-year-olds, there's not really a difference between the talker variability there, and we actually have Bayesian evidence for the null here. So that means that we have evidence against there being a difference in this case. So very broadly, what that means in terms of adults for this particular vocabulary learning is that we see evidence of some sort of benefits of having talker variability in learning for production, but not for comprehension. Comprehension might well be due to a ceiling effect because they're really quite close to ceiling at that after a short amount of training. So that's not surprising, but not seeing it in production is quite interesting. And these findings are quite in line with previous research on vocabulary learning. So what that suggests so far is that adults take information about talkers into account when they're learning patterns in the new language, so when they're learning words in this case. For children, we don't really see a benefit of talker variability in either production or comprehension. And that kind of goes against research on vocabulary learning in children, where there is some evidence that suggests there should be a difference. But it does line up with a study or 2 that find more mixed results. So it could be the case that there are different factors at play. So in the 2 age groups in performance, we do see a numeric difference in the sense that there is a little bit of a difference if you look at the graph, but it doesn't come out significantly statistically. And on the whole, given that we're not really seeing anything, but the literature is a little bit more mixed, it might just be the case that talker variability for children can be useful for learning depending on what kind of task they're doing, how difficult the task is, and what kind of capacities the learner has, whether they're able to do certain things yet or not. So that gives a very broad idea. What we know so far with this one study is whether this idea of a talker variability benefit is there might depend on what kind of processing costs are involved, how difficult the task is, how many skills your learner has. So if you look at it for vocabulary learning, that's quite a high level task. It's not just sort of learning the words, but it involves mapping meaning to word forms and then being able to remember those word forms and reproduce those word forms. So there's quite a lot going on. Adults can do this. Children might just find this task generally quite a bit more difficult. So after doing this quite high level task, how about looking at a more lower level task where we're trying to see if they can differentiate word forms through telling different sounds apart. So learning phonemes rather than mapping things up to meaning. So that's where the next study came in, where we looked at learning the phonetics of a second language, trying to sort of hone in on what might be going on in these children. And this was work of my PhD with Bronwyn Evans and Liz Wanacott. And this is, again, perhaps stating the obvious, but languages tend to have different speech sounds, so different phonemes. And when you're learning a language that you don't natively speak, and it has phonemes that you don't have in your native language, those are generally the ones that are harder to learn. They can be quite hard to get hang of. They take a little bit longer than ones that are closer to what you're learning or are existing to, or map onto existing ones that you have in your native language. So fortunately, practice can help acquire these phonemes, which the fact that I'm talking to you in English while not natively speaking English suggests as much. And an often used paradigm for learning non-native phonemes is known as phonetic training. And the way that paradigm works is, again, people are played a word, so in this case, rock, and they're given two options on the screen, rock and lock in this case, where we're trying to teach the contrast between r and l, and they're asked which of these two did you think that you heard? You have to click the option and you get told whether you have it right or not. So trial by trial feedback throughout the training that you're getting. And the way this, the important part of this sort of training paradigm is that the training of the learners on the phoneme contrasts works through minimal pairs. So the words that are always shown on the screen only differ in one sound, making sure that people can focus in on what distinguishes those two words and what makes those two phonemes distinct from each other. Now, there's early work from the early 90s that trained Japanese learners on this RL contrasts in English that found that this paradigm was quite useful. And in a follow-up study from that same lab, they suggested that talk variability was key in actually getting learning beyond the trained items, so getting people to generalize onto words and talkers they hadn't heard or seen before. So given that, what we wanted to do was try and see what we can do with this with children. Now, step one for this was actually hang on, the paradigm as it exists traditionally uses orthography. So click on the word that you hear out of these two options. That's great if you're working with adults, but if you're working with 7-year-olds, a little bit harder because you need to have some knowledge of the orthography. It's probably easier if your language has a consistent orthography or you're working with things like consonants that tend to be a little bit more consistent. But it also requires some knowledge of the spelling, and children generally have at least less of that, if not none of it, if it's not a language they don't know yet. And similarly, you can't really use that with learners who are naive learners, so who don't know anything about the language at all. So the first step we had here before managing to implement this is let's adapt this phonetic training paradigm to be able to use it with people who have little to no knowledge of the orthography of the language that you're trying to teach them, or the language that you're trying to teach them the speech sounds from. And particularly because if you provide these learners who don't know anything about the orthography yet with orthography from that language, they will possibly activate their existing representations of their native languages instead. You don't know what that maps onto, how that might sound, how that relates to what you actually want them to think the sounds are. So you don't really know what you're training them on if you do that instead. So that first aim we had was, can we adapt this paradigm that does not rely on knowledge of the orthography of the language that we're trying to teach, so that we can use it with learners who don't have this knowledge. Now, the first study we did for this was switching to a different set of language. So instead, we here used minimal triplets, so minimal pairs, but 3, containing one of 3 Dutch vowels. Oh, that animation is out of order, but there we go. We were trying to get them to learn vowels mapping to geometrical shapes, to basically avoid having them try and sound things out in their head because of written letters. Try and go, okay, if we tell them that there's vowels, they map onto shapes that you don't really particularly have a word for straight off the bat. Can we get them to map those? And to try and do this, we worked with minimal triplets of 3 Dutch vowels, so O, U, and O, in things like koos, goose, goose. These 3 vowels were chosen particularly because they are quite tricky for English native speakers to tell apart. So English native speakers were the target audience for this. Can we get them to learn these mappings and learn to tell these apart? So off I went into some more schools to try this out on some children. And what we did, we also tested this on some adults who were not in schools so much. But what we found there is purely on the training task itself, because we're just trying to adapt to the paradigm. Before we look at anything pre and post, can they do this? Adults on one training session show some improvement over 4 blocks. So this was about 300 trials, so 10-15 minutes worth of training. They do show some improvement, which is useful. It would be something that we could potentially use with adults. But if you then look at what the children do, it turns out is they are just above chance, impressively. But they don't change at all over the one session. And for children, it took a little bit longer to do that session. But there's not really any evidence that they can do this task, so that this task is having any kind of effective learning. So before we decided that that would work to extend to a training program where in the end they might not be learning anything, we figured we might need to adjust this paradigm a little bit. So maybe actually having concrete words might help. Because right now we've given them some A-formers blobs. That's just a bit weird because that's not how you really experience language when you come across it in the real world. Generally speaking, if you come across speech sounds, they tend to be attached to a word that they're in. So we kept the same 3 Dutch vowels because we were still working with English children. And now instead of mapping onto shapes, they mapped onto meaningful pictures. We did not give them the meaning of the pictures. We just gave them the picture to see if that made a difference. And because of the need of actually needing words that had meaning, we had to switch to minimal pairs in this case, but they are still covering the same vowels. So off I went into some more schools, different ones from before, to make sure that we had a different set of children learning things that weren't primed by anything that I tried to teach them before. And what we see here is, again, for adults, they can still do this. They show improvement. They find this a little bit easier than the previous task. But children this time also show improvement over a training session. So that suggests that actually something's going on, they're learning something. So we have some sort of task that seems to work in getting something going in terms of learning. The variability conditions of talker variability you don't have to worry too much about. At this point, what we just want to see is some change from chance at how accurate they are at being able to tell things apart. So we see learning on one session. That suggests at least we can use this task for a full-length multiple session training, because usually for training tasks or learning paradigms, you want to have multiple sessions to get a decent amount of learning to be able to get them to get the hang of what is going on. So that's where we came in with the next study, which is basically still learning second language phonetics, but with longer training. So going from one session to 8 training sessions, and this is still PhD work with Bronwyn Evans and Liz Wanacott. So what we did here is actually switch languages, because English primary schools are happy for you to sort of take children out of the classroom for 20 minutes and teach them some random Dutch words, but they find it really hard to say yes to taking a child out of the classroom for 3 weeks in a row for 20 minutes a day to teach them some Dutch words, because it's not part of the curriculum and it doesn't really fit in with the fact that they're trying to learn French in school. So that didn't really work as well. On the other hand, if you go to the Netherlands and you say, can we teach these children some English? they're very happy because that's part of the curriculum. So that made recruitment a little bit easier, given the number of children we needed. That was quite important. So we switched to having native Dutch children who are 7 and 11 learn English vowels instead, where we have this question that we wanted to answer initially. Do we see an effect of talker variability here in how they learn and how they can generalize to new stuff? Now, at this point, you might wonder, hang on, Dutch is quite close to English and Dutch people are generally known to be quite good at English, so this might have made the task quite easy. The training was particularly on minimal pairs that are really hard for Dutch speakers, and here I will turn into my own example and sometimes fail at producing contrasts for this. So it was the 4 contrasts: bed and bad, which is one that does not natively exist in Dutch, pull and pull, shut and shot, and then heel hole was in there as a control contrast, and to make sure that you don't get very sad children who don't get anything right and who don't really want to do the task anymore, so that they get some points at least for something. So these 3 are the main contrasts that we're actually interested in, and they are known to be really quite difficult to learn. Now, if you want, you can listen to all of the stimuli and look at the entire analysis plan, because this is pre-registered on the Open Science Framework. So there's a whole bunch of information there. But what we did for this is Dutch primary school children, all in the same primary school. So we managed to get 50 7-year-olds and 39 11-year-olds, and that's the oldest age in primary school in the Netherlands. We tested them in all sorts of setups across a training session or a training study of 10 days, essentially. They did a pre-test on day 1 where they did 5 different tests of sort of establishing a baseline. Then they did 8 days of training of about 30 minutes a day of this phonetic training type thing. And then they did a post-test again with a bunch of tests there. And they were the same as the pre-test. So for the training itself, I've got a recording. I don't actually know if it will play the sound at you. That's basically what it did. It played a word. Children had to choose one of 2 options. They got coins if they get it right. They get some feedback on whether they have it right or not. And this key manipulation of talker variability came back in this training input, because we had 2 versions of the task. Half the children were given a version where they only heard one person the entire time. That was the low variability version. The other half of the children were given the high variability version, so they heard 4 different talkers in this training that they had throughout the multiple days. And what we were predicting here is particularly looking at the effect of learning and generalization, and seeing if there's a difference between which of the talker variability version people had on how much they learned. So some of the tasks post-tests have new voices and new items in, so that we can test if they are generalizing, basically. And what we're expecting to see in those tasks is that those who had high talker variability in training do better on the tasks at post-test that have talkers they haven't heard before and items they haven't heard before. So we're basically expecting better test performance after having had high variability training. And again, the whole thing is on the Open Science Framework if you want to look at it. There's also a preprint for the whole thing already. So there's a whole bunch that you can look at if you're interested. I'm happy to talk about it more. But for the training itself, let's look at what we see first, because we want to make sure that we actually do see learning. We saw that in the 1 session, but we want to make sure we still see it across 8 sessions. So on the x-axis, we've got the different days of training. We're starting from 0.5, that's chance between choosing from 2 options. And the fact that I'm starting the graph at 0.5 tells you something about where the results are roughly going to be. And we're looking at proportion correct, so going between 0.5 and 1. Now, the different variability conditions are the different colors. So people who had multiple talkers are going to be in black. The ones who had a single talker are going to be in yellow. And the age groups have different shapes, but I'll walk you through them separately because they are quite distinct in the pattern they have. So if you look at the 7-year-olds, they start off at roughly about 60% accurate. And by the end of day 8 of training, they get up to around 70-ish%. And in the 11-year-olds, they start off a bit higher, but they improve roughly the same amount. Now, at this point, you might be looking at this graph and going, Gwen, all of the yellow lines are higher than the black ones. You've just been saying you're expecting high variability to do better than low variability, and this graph is doing the opposite. That's because this is a training task. So in generalization, we want to see, or we expect to see, high variability to be more helpful. In training, it's probably easier if you only have one person, because you have to only hear that one person. You don't have any switching costs between talkers. You don't have any sort of side effects of that. So this is expected. This comes back in other research that looks at training for variability, talker variability. That's not an odd thing. The thing that is more odd is the other thing that might be that you might be shouting at your screen right now, which is what is going on in day 6, because everyone goes down. So remember, this is a school. I went into the school every day with these children. There are 5 working days in a week. So after day 5, there was a weekend, and then day 6 is the Monday after the weekend. So they drop a little bit in performance, but thankfully not all the way back to where they started, and they continue on. But I always find that quite entertaining one to see show up so clearly in the graph. Now, in terms of results, what we see here is in both age groups, they are well above chance, which you can quite clearly see. And we see an improvement across sessions. For the youngest children, there is actually ambiguous Bayesian evidence for whether there is a difference between the age groups and how much they learn across the session, or not the age groups, the variability groups and how much they learn across the sessions. For the 11-year-olds, there is evidence that the low variability starts off and continues on higher than the high variability, but there is ambiguous evidence again that that amount that they learned different. So that's basically suggesting they're learning similar amounts, but the task is a little bit easier if you only have one person. Now that's training. We want to know what they do on the post-test. And one of the tasks I'm going to talk you through is picture identification task, which is basically similar to training, but without getting feedback. So if we play them the word pool, can they say which of these 2 it was, so that they're linking it to the picture. And for the 7-year-olds, they are a little bit above chance at pre-test. At post-test, they haven't really changed much, and it really doesn't seem to do much also in terms of variability condition. For the 11-year-olds, they start off higher at pre-test, and at post-test, they do actually show change. So they do go up in performance. So on the whole, the 7-year-olds don't actually show any improvement on this statistically. The 11-year-olds do. They do improve, but on both cases, we see evidence against a difference between the variability conditions. So there's no evidence here that the amount of change or any kind of performance is different depending on what version of training people had. So that's quite interesting. That's quite unexpected, because we were expecting high variability to show better results on post-test. Now, we also have a discrimination task. So can they hear the difference between 3 vowels? If there's one of them, that's the odd one out. And for that, the 7-year-olds, this graph is a little bit more complicated because we've got both new items and trained items. But the short version of what's going on for the 7-year-olds is there's basically no change statistically here. The 11-year-olds start off again a bit higher, and they show some change on the right, but you can see that here only on the whole, as sort of numerically things kind of fall apart a little bit, because if you look at this statistically, both groups are above chance, which in this case is 33%, but the younger children don't show any improvement. The older children show similar improvement across the board, but again, evidence for differences between the variability condition are ambiguous, so we can't really say there's anything going on there. So at this point, both adults, or both children who are 7 and who are 11 show improvement during training, where having one person to learn from is easier, but having that distinct difference between pre and post test shows that younger children are able to do the task. They are above chance, but they don't improve on these tasks, so they don't really generalize what they've learned yet to novel voices and novel items. And older children do improve on some of the tasks. There were a few more that I didn't show you. It's a little bit all over the place, basically. So there's some evidence of generalization, but it seems to be a bit task specific. It doesn't seem to always hold for everything. So the one thing that does hold across all of the tasks is that in none of them do we find evidence for a high variability benefit, and in some of the tasks we even find evidence against it. So that suggests that that talk of variability benefit we were expecting given the literature. Haven't really seen any of that here in children. So it's quite odd that we don't see this, because it's supposed to help tune into the right cues, and we're not seeing any evidence for it helping. Might be down to things I mentioned at the start. Task is maybe more complex, could have been too difficult for the children. It might have been that talk of variability could be useful once they've got the hang of the task. But we also didn't find any evidence for it in either age group, and that's despite the fact that we do find learning and generalization in the 11-year-olds. So if the task is complex, they can still do it. So there should be something going on there. So at this point, we were a bit confused. We were wondering, are we actually sure that the adults really show this benefit of talk of variability? Because in the children, we don't see any evidence for it anywhere. So let's go back to the adults and see what was going on there. So that's where the paper that you mentioned earlier came in, where we went on to do a replication study looking at talk of variability in phonetic training. And this was work with Nadine Levan, Haruka Saito, Megan Clayards, and Liz Winnicott. And that one is available for you to read in full by now. So what we did here is we went back to these original studies that I mentioned at the start that found that phonetic training on RNL for Japanese learners in English works in the paradigm, and particularly saying that generalization requires talk of variability. So these are studies from the 90s. The main thing that they find is the paradigm works. That's something that we've also found. That's not something we're surprised by, but that claim of having more high variability, more generalization after high variability input comes from that study from 1993. So at this point, why would we want to replicate this, given that there seems to be quite good evidence for it? And it has been found in other places. Well, this idea of having a high variability benefit has proved to be quite influential across the second language speech learning research. There's a handful of the studies that use this. And the thing that is key between all of these studies is they tend to take high variability is key. Let's run with that version of it all. So if you actually look at what is in the literature, for those studies that do look at high versus low variability, there's very little evidence that things are clear cut. There's mixed evidence. Some things are linked to tasks or aptitude. So there's a lot of mixed things going on in the existing literature. And when we went back to the original studies, we also found that there were some potential methodological issues that might have resulted in the findings being a little bit more complicated. So one of them is that those studies from the 90s only had 6 participants in each experiment, which, given that they had to get people in for weeks of training, is understandable, but also means that there's questions of how generalizable everything is. They presented the version of the high talk of variability and low talk of variability across 2 different papers, which means that they never did a statistical comparison on this. The claim was based on numerical differences, which would be less of an issue if they also took into account a difference from pre to post tests, but they looked purely at performance after training without taking into account where people started off. And the importance of this became clear once we looked at the numbers. So if you look at how good people were after this training in the studies in the 90s, for the high talk of variability, they were nearly 80% accurate. Low talk of variability, they were 75, which based on that, you would think, okay, yeah, there seems to be a difference here. But at pre-test, the people who had high variability already started at 78%. So they didn't improve all that much, while the people who started at low variability improved quite a bit more. In fact, there's a difference of about 5% in how much improvement you're seeing here. And this paper claimed that high variability showed more learning or more generalization, which, if you look at the amount of improvement, is actually not necessarily the case. So given that, we wanted to replicate this. So what we did is have this same question: do we find a high variability benefit in generalization when taking into account how people started off? The design we did for this study is very similar to the stuff I've talked about so far. So there's pre-tests, training study, post-tests. And the training study here was 15 sessions. And the post-tests and generalization tasks I can talk about in a bit more detail if you've got questions. But just to give you an idea, it's very similar to general phonetic training paradigms. And that variability condition here was operationalized as high variability, 5 talkers throughout 15 training sessions. Low variability is 1 talker. So the sample we ended up with was 166 Japanese learners of English. Like the original, they had Japanese learners of English. The sample size was powered to be able to find evidence of this effect if it was there through simulation. And I'm happy to talk about that if you've got questions. The other thing that was really wonderful was that we contacted the original authors and they gave us the stimuli list. So we used the same items that they used in the original study with the RL contrast minimal pairs. And we used base factor analyses because given the mixed literature, we weren't entirely sure if we were going to find evidence for or against something. So we wanted to make sure we had possibilities of finding evidence of a null. And you can find the whole thing online. So for training, as I mentioned, 15 sessions. Oh, spoilers, don't look at the right quite yet. My animation is a bit off, but we're looking at 15 sessions, starting from, again, 0.5 being chance, going up to 1 as mean proportion correct in terms of accuracy. Same colors for the variability as before. So black is high variability, yellow is low. And now the spoilers with the actual graph. You can see that there's very little difference between which version of training people got. They improved roughly the same amount. In fact, there's only about 2% difference between how much they improved. There's not one that's really clearly starting off higher or lower than the other. So if you look at this in terms of stats, we find evidence against there being a difference in how much people learn and improve in these two variability conditions, which is good. That means that no matter which version of training you get, you learn roughly the same amount. Now, the key thing that we're interested in here is generalization. So do we find that people who had high variability training of this RL contrast do better at post-test with new people they haven't heard? So at pre-test, for the people who've got high variability, they're in black here, they start off at around 60%, yellow, similar, they're roughly same at pre-test. And what we're expecting is for the black one to show more improvement than the yellow. And if you look at this and you have to look really close, you might think sort of like, maybe it's in there, maybe it's not. It's very hard to tell. So looking at that numerically, what we see here is an improvement in the high variability condition of 8.5% and the low variability condition of 7.6%. So very, very similar, but a little bit in the direction of that predicted effect. But if you look at it, in terms of stats, what you find is you find evidence that individually high variability improving 8.5% is an amount of improvement that is significant from chance. Same for low variability, but the evidence of there being a difference between the amounts of improvements depending on the talker variability is actually ambiguous, so we can't really say. And what that means, because you might now think, okay, you said ambiguous, what do we do with that? The way we interpret this is that, broadly speaking, this replication shows that phonetic training works, but that's not something that we were particularly worried about. That's not new. But we actually find meaningful null results here because we don't find evidence for an effect of talker variability. And what was key in this particular study is that the sample size was powered to find an effect of talker variability if it was existent in the data. So the fact that we don't find it here actually suggests that something else is going on, and it's quite meaningful in that sense. So the thing it's particularly suggesting is that this phonetic training paradigm actually possibly isn't sensitive enough to be able to pick up on talker variability benefits in the first place. So the reason that we don't see this might be because it's just not possible to distinguish this level of detail. And if it does exist within the paradigm, the differences that you see as a result of talker variability is very small. It would need to be smaller than what the literature reports, and the literature reports differences of about 5%. So it would be less than 5% difference as a result of adding talkers. And at that point, you've got the question of how small of a difference is still realistically meaningful in real life, and how much use is that difference that you're seeing. So to wrap everything up, of all the talker variability I've thrown at you just now, is there a talker variability benefit
anywhere. So far, I have not found any evidence for it. In many cases, I found Bayesian evidence against it. And that's quite surprising given the existing work that's out there. But it really drives home the question that we don't actually know what talker variability is and what is supposed to be helpful about it. Because the way it's operationalized is one versus multiple talkers. But what is it about the multiple talkers that's helping? Is it the acoustics being different between the talkers? Is it distinct identities that people can link to in terms of voices? Is it social linguistic identities that they can tell the people apart and have ideas about them? We don't really know. And that's something to look into in more detail. But also, if a talker variability does exist, how much is the smallest meaningful difference that we would be interested in? At what point does it become not really that useful for these type of learning studies? So those are some open questions that I'm kind of leading into at the moment, looking into what kind and how much variability is helpful and for who, because it might differ depending on the learner. And more work is needed for that to be able to find that out. So hopefully we'll get back to you on that in the future. But for now, I'll finish with thanking all of the 363 children and 513 adults that were part of the datasets that I just showed you, and the schools in London and the Netherlands and the universities in Japan helping recruit this, and the original authors for that final paper for giving us the stimuli for the replication. And yeah, thank you very much.